I guess for those of us joining us, Jim is guesting here today with us, and we're going to be talking to Dennis Stone. Jim has been to Dennis's, well, what would you call it? Attraction, I suppose, numerous times.
Attraction, yeah.
Back when I knew it, it was Mystery Hill. Now I'm seeing more and more about America's Stonehenge.
Yeah.
I was just telling this story about how long ago it was when I first went there. I'm guessing 30 years, probably closer to 40. And Dennis's father, Robert, back then you had the place pretty much all to yourself. There weren't near the tourists they have now. And Robert just happened to meet us in the parking lot when we drove up. And I didn't even know who he was. He said, "Is this your first time here?" And I said, "Sure." And so he said, "Well, do you want me to show you around?" And I said, "I'd love it." So he took me around. We were halfway through the tour. Matter of fact, I remember exactly where I was standing at the big slab, but they're called the sacrificial altar table, with the groove running around it. And we were standing right there when I first realized who he was. Oh, this is the guy that owns the place. I was really honored. It was just it was just really great. And since then, I've been back, at least a half a dozen times. I'm just absolutely fascinated to go there.
Cool. Yeah. So I think that we're going to have a great chat tonight here. And before we jump into it, I'm just going to read Dennis's bio. So we're going to be talking about America's Stonehenge, which, if you don't know, it's basically it's an ancient megalithic site in the state of
New Hampshire.
New Hampshire. Okay. And there's not a lot of megalithic sites in North America, but this is one of the most interesting. And so we're gonna jump into have a great discussion on that. And we've got with us tonight Dennis Stone, who is the owner and proprietor of what is now the attraction of America's Stonehenge. But of course, it's been there for thousands of years. So it's kind of a interesting position to be able to own such a thing. Anyway, so Dennis is the president of America's Stonehenge. He graduated from Daniel Webster College in 1977 with a degree in aviation management, then was a full-time commercial pilot for 35 years before retiring and devoting his time to the Stonehenge. And it was the location was opened up to the public in 1958 by Dennis's father, Robert. Dennis has been involved in the America's Stonehenge for most of his life and has always had a fascination with archaeology and archaeoastronomy. And so since retiring, Dennis has been able to discover a lot of new and interesting things at the site, such as a number of these serpentine walls, which I'm sure he'll tell us about, and spirit windows. So yeah, we are looking forward to talking about getting some more details on that. And I guess let's get into it here. So Dennis, and I'm also gonna should just mention the website, www.stonehengeusa.com. And it's also on Facebook at facebook.com/StonehengeUSA. And I'll go ahead and I'll put links to that on top of this video while I edit it. So maybe Jim, do you have a question to start out with?
Yeah, I'd like to get kind of caught up a little bit since it's been years since I've been there. Dennis, the last time I was there, when I stood in those wonderful viewing spots and saw those standing stones that were set up, the last time I was there, they were, I was told that they lined up astrologically to, about what, 1800 BCE, something like that, almost 4,000 years ago, which would have put it at just about the time Stonehenge 4 was being built in England. Obviously, someone had raised these standing stones in New Hampshire to line up with the solstice and the equinox. Is that still the case? What's the latest on that?
Right. Yeah. 1800 BC is the correct date, plus or minus about 200 or so years on either side of that the alignments will work due to the Earth's tilt. It's a very slow tilt of the Earth. They call it the obligity cycle. It's a up and down cycle. And it takes about 41,000 years for that particular cycle. Sometimes people confuse that with the precessional cycle, which is almost 26,000 years. So the Earth is doing a couple of wobbles and it actually tilts. And that's from a 1978 Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics analysis of the survey data. And we hired a professional surveyor almost 50 years ago. In 1973, we hired Beverly Pearson and Associates of Derry, New Hampshire. That's up the road about 8 miles from the site. And over the next 5 years, they would come, as we had money to fund it, they would come down and survey about 15 out of the 110 acres we have where the astronomical alignments are located. And by 1977, they had completed what we call phase 1 of the 15 acres, the monoliths where the sun rises and sets, moon rises and so forth. And they fed it into a computer during that winter of 77, 78. And we actually have the name of the person that did the analysis and everything. And when we get the results back, they said if these alignments were used for that purpose, they would work about 1800 BC, plus or minus a few hundred years.
Wow.
And that agreed with our 1971 radiocarbon dating. We've taken about 12 carbon datings of the site, starting in 1967 through 1995. And 1971 of a structure called the Chamber in Ruins. We had a carbon dating from 1969 of charcoal in the same area, what we call the north wall of the structure. And it has about a 7,000-pound roof slab that's collapsed into the structure. But the north wall, they began working on that excavation in 1967. And what they found was a piece of root at that time growing through the wall from a stump. And it was a white pine that we have photographs from the 1930s. So 40 years after the photographs were taken in the 1930s, they actually obtained a piece of root. And I have the pictures of that as they excavated and found the root going into the wall. You don't build a structure around the tree. The tree went through the wall. And that dated to 1690 AD. So put it back before basically the colonial period in the local area. You know, the Pilgrims had already landed and everything, but it still goes back before the Paddy family. The Paddy family is a family that a lot of mainstream people think have built the whole site, you know, and they were actually shoemakers, 5 generations of shoemakers, and they had domesticated animals, but mainstream basically blamed them for the construction of the site over the years. But this put it back before they were even on the property or owned the property or even in the area. And in 1969, they found charcoal several inches below that layer, and that dated to 3,000 years old in 1971. As they were digging further, they found more charcoal, and it was carbon dated by Geochrome Laboratories in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I believe that company has moved to Lowell, Massachusetts today. But so the 1978 astronomical data seem to agree with the radiocarbon datings from that chamber. So a couple of ways of dating it. And one thing that might have changed, I'm not sure the last year that visited us, was called, as you mentioned, Mystery Hill. And that's still the name of the hill. It never really had an official name. People called it Paddy's Hill because of the Paddy family and so forth. But on the topographical maps, it was kind of a blank. So my dad, when he first opened in 58, it was called the Stone Ruins of New Hampshire. And in 1958 into 59 during the winter, he actually changed the name to Mystery Hill Cave. By 63, he dropped the word caves, for people are confusing it with natural caves, and these are actually man-made chambers. So it became Mystery Hill. And the name of the hill officially at some point became Mystery Hill. In 1982, the name of the place was changed to America's Stonehenge. So I don't know if that kind of helps you out when you visited us or not, but it was 1982. So that was 40 years ago already. Wow.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, that's. That was about it. I'm no older. Are you?
40 years ago, exactly. Yeah, I haven't.
So what you're saying is then with undeniable science, not only from the astronomical point of view, but from the carbon dating, we had people raising standing stones and building stone chambers, unique stone chambers, using the same technology that was going on. And they were doing it at the very same time the fourth phase of Stonehenge was being built in England. If America's Stonehenge, if that existed in England, there would be no question whatsoever who did it and when and how and maybe even to some sense why. But because it was here in America, people didn't want to accept it. Can you talk a little about the history of the complete denial you had from so many archaeologists for so long who simply would not accept the fact that perhaps there were megalithic builders here in America back then?
Right. Basically, there shouldn't be any ancient stone builders, pre-colonial stone builders in the Northeast. As you go out west, we have perhaps, they estimate 1 million mounds built by ancient man across from the Ohio Valley to the Rio Grande, right into Florida. We just came back from visiting some of the mounds, Turtle Mound near Cape Kennedy, one of the biggest shell mounds in the world, and then Crystal River Mound. We've been to them before. So there was a lot of activity in North America. And you get into the cliff dwellings further out west, Indian medicine wheels, and even geoglyphs. It looked like the NASCAR lines, which are out in Colorado. But in the Northeast, you're not supposed to have these ancient stone ruins. And actually, when my dad got involved in 1955, he was listening to a radio show. It was called Yankee Yarns. Alton Hall Blackington was the talk show host on a Friday night. My dad lived 7 or 8 miles from this place and never had heard about America's Stonehenge. And that Friday night, it was all about this site. He was pretty blown away by the topic and this mysterious stone ruins right next door to him, basically. That same week, he's at a barber shop waiting to have his hair cut. He picks up a magazine and he's flipping through the pages and he sees pictures and a whole feature article about these same stone ruins. He just turned on the radio, a few days before that. And when he asked the barber if he could keep the magazine, because he was just astonished by this, he goes, "Well, how old is that magazine?" He goes, 1952. It's a 1952 New Hampshire profile magazine. It's been sitting there for 3 years. And, it's one of those coincidences. They didn't throw it away. And the next weekend, my dad took that magazine to my aunt and uncle's in the same town of Derry. And they're playing cards with 10 people, passed the magazine around. Nobody recognized it. It was pretty typical. A lot of people hadn't heard of this place. And as my aunt and uncle, though, looked at the pictures and the story, they said, wait a minute, we were there in the 1930s. They used to pedal their bikes down when they were dating, bicycles actually, and they picnicked up on the hill. So, of course, my dad's next question is, can you find a place? And it was not open to the public, no road signs. There wasn't anything leading people to our site back then. And so they said, well, we'll give it a shot. But, 20 years have gone by. So they rode around the next day, the 4 of them. And I was a baby at the time, so I probably stayed with my grandparents. And they rode around North Salem trying to find this place. And then they saw a road that looked vaguely familiar, an old back road. And they all walked up about a third of a mile up the hill, and there's the site. Much to their relief, they actually found it. Wow. And the chain fence that was put up by Mr. Goodwin, that chain link fence has been there since 1937, and it still looks like new. My dad climbed under, the other one stayed outside of it. And when he came back out, of course, quite a while he was inside looking at the stone ruins. And when he came out, he was just blown away again. And he said to my mom something about he would love to get involved with the investigation, the research, the study, maybe open it up as a museum someday. And because my mom's reply was something about you got rocks in your head, which is true, And after that, his whole life was changed, and I guess our family's life was changed after that. He had been in the Coast Guard in the early 50s, and he was up in Labrador, and he was right near where the Vikings landed, and he was always interested in that. But it was before Meadow had been really, I guess, officially discovered around 1960-ish. He had been there about, 50 to 53 or something like that for a couple of years. And then he was an AT&T Bell Laboratories engineer, for 30 years. So he had a full-time job. We all basically have full-time careers. And he worked out a deal with the owner, Malcolm Pearson. From 1955 until 1957, he made arrangements to put a building up, what we call the visitor center, a parking lot, the trail system, a septic system, a well, and all of that stuff. He had to go to the town and the state and all of that. And eventually opened it up in the summer solstice, which is kind of cool, of 1958. We didn't know about the astronomy back then.
Yeah.
And in 1959, at Saturday Evening Post did a whole feature on our site. And the writer actually referred to it as the Stonehenge of America because of the big stones, but not the astronomical alignments. Yeah. And actually, Stonehenge, people realized there were alignments, but it wasn't until Gerald Hopkins in 1965. Stonehenge Dakota came out. It was a big seller, a big hit. CBS put out a special based on the book, I guess, called The Mystery of Stonehenge, if I recall. I saw it back in the 70s. I saw it in the 60s, too. I saw it at a library. You probably can pull it up on YouTube. And when my dad and other researchers saw that, they said, we know about these stones all around the property that are standing. Some are fallen, but they look like monoliths.
Yeah.
Maybe they're aligned with the heavens. We don't know. It's just one of those speculative guesses, basically. So in 1965, they decided to open up one of the avenues, and that turns out to be the winter solstice sunset alignment. Wow. But we didn't actually witness it until 1967. And the gentleman that did it and actually cleared it out is actually a nuclear engineer. He put the 2 nuclear reactors on the Nimitz, and he just finished up at Fukushima 10 years ago. But he was a very brilliant guy. And he's a guy that actually was one of our staff from 1963. He was a guide. Then he became assistant manager. And I was just talking to him today. He just came back from France. He has a nice little home up on an island in Maine. And he's still interested in the site. He's going to come back this summer, I think, for the first time in over 50 years to watch the sunset. Wow. Yeah. But he opened up that alignment. And it was, again, very kind of, it was all speculation at that point. And he opened up the alignment. It took him to 67 to take the first picture. And he gave me the pictures last fall. I had never seen those photographs. And there were cirrus clouds. So when the sun set over this beautiful, looks like a big arrowhead, you could see where the sun was. It was just a kind of a bright spot. So you couldn't see the orb of the sun, though. So in 1970, while he was working on the Nimitz, Newport News, he drove his bug eye, 1958, I guess Triumph, I believe it was, up to his parents, who lived right next to our property. And we met him there, and he had built a wooden snowmobile, and it worked. The guy was just very, he had to break the trail almost a half a mile. It was about over a foot of snow. So he broke the trail. So my dad, my friend, one of my high school friends from Derry, and Warren. So 4 of us went up there. Well, actually 3 of us followed him as he broke the trail. And we were standing there on December 20th, 1970, and we actually saw the sun, the full orb, it was between the clouds, beautiful. And the sun actually set on the stone. And that was the first real good photograph we ever had of that. Wow. Astronomical work really took off after that.
I'm thinking it must have been 67 or 66, somewhere around there. Or, 76 or 77 when I went there to see those sunsets. You had a platform built, and we stood on the platform and looked at them. So that was about that time then. Ken, I don't want to dominate all the questions, but since we were talking about alignments and we were talking about Stonehenge, I have to ask about something that I've heard about and I've seen some videos on it, but this happened after I was there. Tell me about discovering those wonderful alignments. If you the Great Circle route, for instance, which alights right on Stonehenge and goes all the way to Beirut. Can you talk about those alignments?
Yeah, a little bit. That happened 10 years ago. My son, Kelsey, he's an engineer too. He works at Raytheon, as a matter of fact, but a lot of engineers in the family. But he was in college, and it was, I think, spring break, and he was actually using Google Earth just to see on these alignments that there are other sites located in New England, just along. And they talked about that in the 1970s before Google Earth. People had to actually go on these hills, and there are some cairns and other structures on some of these alignments. Could be coincidental. But he was interested in that, and he went across on the summer solstice sunrise to the northeast. Then he took it right across from Hampshire into Maine, and right across the Atlantic Ocean eventually, just for kicks. And he had been to Stonehenge a couple times as a kid, and he noticed it was.
This was using a Google, I take it. Google, yeah.
Google Earth, And so when he went across that straight line, he goes from the platform you mentioned. There used to be 2 cairns here up to a little over 80 years ago. Unfortunately, the first researcher, Mr. Goodwin, didn't know what their purpose was. He actually thought there were beehive chambers connected to the biggest structure called the Oracle Chamber. You might remember that.
Sure. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It was not, though. They were actually independent structures, and they weren't hollow. They were solid. We believed they're the astronomical markers, but he didn't know that in the 1930s. So we got pictures of a tripod with a hand winch, and he was cranking up the rocks off it. He actually had a crew taking it apart, using it for the ramp, with a table across from where what we call the sacrificial table is. There's a few rocks still remaining in that area. Unfortunately, he basically destroyed it. And by the 70s, about almost 40 years later, 35 to 40 years later, we realized his mistake. And we look back, it's in his book he wrote in 1946 called The Ruins of Great Ireland and New England. And a lot of his records we have, he actually diagrams those two cairns. There's photographs taken by his right-hand man, Malcolm Pearson, who was a professional photographer. And that's a gentleman my dad eventually bought the property from. And he destroyed the astronomical center. But it goes from that, one of the cairns is in alignment with the summer solstice sunrise and several others. And the other southern cairn actually aligns with the rest of the alignments. And they're actually adjacent to each other, these two cairns originally. And we got, like I say, we had the photograph and the diagrams of them and the description of them. And it goes across an oval shaped stone circle. It's actually an ellipse with a stone in the center of it where you actually stood. In order to have an alignment, you had the back sight and foresight, like a gun sight. And so that's probably where you stood. You looked at the monolith, and the monolith has an asymmetrically shaped top. Most of our monoliths have the top of it's right in the center, kind of like an arrowhead. The point's really in the center. This one here has a point on the top left side and it slopes.
I remember that, yeah.
Remember that? Yeah, and we opened that clearing up almost 50 years ago, around 1973. When we looked at the horizon, we noticed about 4 miles distance, the hill has a notch, the same shape as the top of the rock. So in Europe, they call them horizon features. They actually took natural formations into the alignment. So you have your foresight, backsight, you might have a notch on a hill and you line them all up, you know? And that's what it looks like they did there. And then that line my son took right across into England, and he said, gee, this looks like it's close to Stonehenge. And as he changed the scale on Google Earth, all of a sudden, you know, you can see you're in the Salisbury area of, or Avebury in that kind of area. And then as he blew it up more, he's in the Salisbury Plain where Stonehenge is. And then Stonehenge appears and the line goes right through the center of one of the trilithons.
Yeah.
And it continues on and it ends up, like I say, it ends up over in Lebanon, you know, it's just an interesting alignment. Well, my son gave me a little bit of help on using Google Earth back about the same time in 2012. So I decided just to take the south alignment. My son was back at school and busy, so I'll try the south alignment. Well, true south, and people can check us. We appreciate if they do, because, you know, we could be in error. We're only human. But I did that one many times. It goes right through Machu Picchu. Now, somebody may begin and say, Dennis, you're off, you know, whatever, you know. I did the winter solstice sunset, and it goes to the moon pyramid at Teotihuacan, which my dad and I visited about 40 years ago. The equinox sunset goes through Pueblo Bonito at Chaco Canyon, and we were just there 2.5 years ago. The big D-shaped structure at Chaco, it's amazing. You know, I think it had 700. The equinox on that same day, the sunrise, goes to the pyramids in the Canary Islands. And the last one I checked, on the August 1st sunrise, it goes to the Giza Plateau, the Great Pyramid. But and a lot of people have checked these out, to double check, triple check, and everything else, just to make sure it's accurate what we're doing. One, and then you can interpret it the way you want. You know, whether it's just a big coincidence or whether you know, sacred geometry comes into play, and you know, earth energies and all of that.
Let me jump in here, because I did actually double check some of your work. So because I've looked at a lot of these alignment theories from different sites, and you know, there's a lot of really interesting theories. The Giza pyramids have a bunch of different theories on them, and a lot of times it has to do with lining up the corner of the Great Pyramid usually, and supposedly it's supposed to go through Stonehenge as well, or you know, a few other things. There's also these lines in St. Michael's, they call it the St. Michael's ley line, and so it's supposed to link up a couple of different, there's probably about 15 or 20 different sites from England all the way down through Italy and Greece, and they're supposed to connect to generally to the temple in Israel. And I've checked all of these. I've checked the supposed alignments with Versailles in France, and with Oak Island, which is in Nova Scotia, but just north of you guys a little bit. And supposedly all of these things are supposed to have connections. I've checked all of them. None of them pan out, but yours did. And so I took we
try not to make mistakes, but we can, you know.
So I looked at your your spring, it was the spring solstice one that's supposed to go through Stonehenge. And yeah, sure enough, it did. And it was the only of those other dozen lines that I checked, the only one that even came anywhere close to where it said it was going to. And
Wow.
it was bang on, like exactly two a couple of inches variance in terms of
Wow.
being able to
Yeah.
hit that trilithon gap.
I
Well,
appreciate
Dennis, about 4 years ago,
Yeah.
I was asked to go to Cornwall and give a lecture, a seminar on the roots of world religions. And of course, while I was in England, I had to stop by Stonehenge. And you'll be glad to know that I stood in Stonehenge, went around to the west, looked toward you, and waved. I thought of you on that day. So
that day. That's pretty cool.
can you mentioned the oracle chamber. Can you kind of take us on a walkthrough and talk about the sacrificial table and the oracle chamber and the connection tube and all that?
Yeah, the oracle chamber is the largest chamber stone tack on the site. It runs roughly just under 30 feet north and south, true directions. Everything up there is true east, north, and south orientation, not magnetic or anything like that. And if you look down at it from the air, people used to call it the Y cabin, or looks like the letter T to me. You know, if you could see through the earth, through the chamber, you know, the shape of it, you know, because it has a north-south axis, and then off to the east, it has another branch. The north-south axis is vertical stacking of flat slabs with big roof slabs on top. When you go off to the east branch, it's all corbelled. You know, it's like an inverted staircase, kind of arched. The roof is kind of an old world technique. You know, I've seen it at Newton, for instance, you know, and a chamber in Massachusetts called the Upton Chamber. It's a really beautiful architectural style, and it kind of bridges the ceiling. But that part of the chamber is corbelled. It has 5 closets in it. These are stone closets. It has like a bench seat that's been actually carved out of this large rock that is actually split. And the rock either was moved by man and separated, or is moved by nature. But I've got a feeling these people moved this rock. It's about 50 tons, and then they built a chamber over it. You kind of walk between 2 stones. If you look at the right side, you can see the original shape of the stone where it's separated. If you look at the left side, it's like a 90-degree bench seat that you can sit in, and it faces one of the beautiful, actually one of the nicest closets there. You know, we call them closets or niches. It has 2 underground drains. These are storm drains with stone roofs and rocks on the side. And some of them are almost big enough for a kid to climb through. I wouldn't recommend it, but they keep the structure dry. And there are actually about 12 drains built throughout the site. They were built and engineered before the structures were built over them. So somebody planned this to keep this place dry. And some of the drains are 75 feet, and one of them goes into like a leach field. It's all these stone cobbles. It's called a pit, actually. So that's all over the site. And the oracle chamber happens to have 2 drains that keep it dry from when the snow melts and also heavy rains and so forth. It has a chimney flue at the north end. And back in 1958, up to that point, there were 2 stone louvers, and we got the photographs of them. You could actually adjust the draft by moving these stone louvers. And in 59, I believe it was, somebody stole them, and all we have is photographs today, which is a shame. The chamber also has a tube, and this tube is, as you walk into the structure, you take a left and you're walking north, and you're going into the main axis of the structure. On your left side is a speaking tube, we call it, 6 foot long. It goes to the sacrificial table. And it's kind of a square-shaped tube, a little bit more rectangular, with top to bottom and left to right in it. And at the end, where it comes out on the table, we found out recently, due to some damage and doing some repair work on it, that it's actually like the end of a trumpet. It actually flared out. And what is that this is a speaking tube or oracle tube where the voice would, and below where you stand in the oracle chamber, there's actually part of the bedrock. The actually left part of it is a step. And if you're around 5.5 feet, I'm 5, almost 5'8", just a little bit under that, you're almost perfect. Your head is in right position to yell through this horizontal tube, and the voice comes out underneath the sacrificial table. I can't think of any reason a shoemaker and he did have, you know, the Paddy family, and they did have some domesticated animals, would ever build anything like this. It doesn't have a lot of volume of space inside of it, but an enormous amount of work to construct the whole thing. Below the speaking tube, there's an 8 foot, what we call a bed. in the wall. I don't know if you remember that. It actually
Yes.
goes
Yes.
in horizontally. I mean, I have no idea. Again, if you go back to this being a farm of some sort or a shoe shop, because the Paddies were cordwainers or shoemakers, why would ever build anything like that? It's very ceremonial to me. The whole thing looks like so many sites that we've seen in different places, you know, where we've traveled to. Not exactly the same, but the same kind of idea, you know. It has that feeling of being a not very practical place, nothing that a farmer, shoemaker would really build or use, but it does look very ceremonial.
Yeah.
So outside the chamber is the sacrificial table. It's on the west side of that structure, and of course the tube comes out underneath it. The table weighs about 9,000 pounds. The weight of granite per cubic foot is about 163 pounds per cubic foot. So you figure out the size of the table, you know, dimensions, you can, without even picking it up. It has 4 legs and it's bell-shaped. And it came from a cutout in a bedrock about 40 feet away. And that cutout is right below where the astronomical center is today. So it brings up a lot of questions about that too.
Mm-hmm.
They going out and then they set the cons over it, apparently. Maybe that was the order of doing this. And the group on the top of the table, there's a groove. It's actually a groove that's trapezoid in shape. We used to think it was rectangular. And recently we measured it very carefully. And it's actually about 9 inches shorter at the top than it is at the bottom. And it's actually a trapezoid shape. We have been doing LiDAR, handheld LiDAR on the site. It's a $50,000 unit. You can see down to 1 centimeter. And the gentleman came up from Connecticut many times, and he walked around the site very carefully over 15 acres. And it took him 600 hours to process the data. When we looked at the table, you can see the trapezoid shape so nicely, you know, when you're just moving around on your computer, the imaging. But a lot of the plan forms of the structures, like the chamber and ruins, not rectangular. One end is actually narrower than the other. It's trapezoid. We didn't know that until recently. The Paddy chamber, which is really not the Paddy chamber, it's like the first when you come into the main site, you go into the small chamber. The inside of that, the floor plan is trapezoid, not rectangular. And the area that we call where the Paddy house sat, over a courtyard, we think it was an ancient courtyard, and the house is no longer there. It actually is not a rectangle either. It's actually a trapezoid in shape. And there's
That's
a little
fascinating. We get a lot of trapezoids in the South American, like the
Yeah.
Incan traditions and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
You're right. I think of that all the time. You're right. Even windows and doorways, I think, and even
Yeah.
artwork. I did read in England some of the. I've been to England many times, but one of a couple of the chambers over there are trapezoid and floor plan too. You know, I'm like, oh, so you know, I think of colonial, post-colonial farm. The Paddies were there for a number of years. They bought the first piece of land in 1734. 1744, they bought another piece of land, and probably by 1750, they built a house there. But I think they would have had rectangular shape, you know, floor plans, you know, or square shape, 3 corners.
Yeah.
So the table groove and even next to the table, what we call the animal pin, it's an open air thing. And you can just stand there and look at it. You can see it's trapezoid in shape again. It's like, but that's only in the last about 5 years that we started recognizing.
Yeah. Well, you know,
oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, you mentioned the ceremonial use. I know that's the big joke in archaeology. Everybody says, oh, it must have been for ceremonial purposes. But boy, I want to tell you, you stand, you know, for all the listeners who have never been to America's Stonehenge, you go in there and you stand in the middle of that place and you feel like you're on holy ground. I swear. It is just an unbelievable feeling of something happened here that was of a spiritual nature. It just seems so obvious when you're there and looking at it. And yet, when I lived up in Massachusetts, I was out in Shutesbury, and I had a number of beehive huts that were built around us that I used to spend a lot of time. And of course, the standard thing was, oh, these are not beehive huts. They were not built by Irish monks or anything like that. They were used to store vegetables, store root vegetables. For one thing, you crawl into one of those things, you can barely make it if you're an adult. How you're going to go in there carrying vegetables, I don't know. Another time when you get in there and you're on that floor, a lot of times you're right out near a swamp. And boy, if you ever want to ruin vegetables real quick, put them in one of those things. I mean, obviously, New England was full of this kind of thing. Stonehenge, I mean, America's Stonehenge being the #1 example probably in all of New England. And yet, for the longest time, people just would not accept it. It went against the grain of, well, religion has fundamentalists. I think archaeology has fundamentalists too, and they just would not accept the fact that New England was an ancient place going back to whenever the glacier melted. It's just amazing to me. So if anybody's listening to this who hasn't been there, man, if you have a chance to go up to New Hampshire and visit one of these things, it's absolutely fantastic. It'll just it'll be a spiritual experience for you. I guarantee it. Really amazing.
Okay, I'm just going to jump in here one sec. So I wanted to mention one thing, and that's with the timing, it's recently been like I think it was just last year where there's been some new archaeological work in North America showing that there was absolutely, definitely 100% like confident that there were people here on the Pacific coast 14,000 years ago. And those are the same people that have been saying all along, hey, we've been here for thousands of years. They're not lying. And they know what they're talking about, and they have these traditions handed down. So I guess that would be one other question that maybe we'll come back to in a minute is there any, what do the legends say about this? If anything, are there anything in the local, First Nations legends or anything of that would mention this? And then
what about the mythology, the stories, the oral histories? I know in New England where you are, I mean, you go back 12,000 years, you're going to bump into the glacier, but it sure seems that once that glacier was gone, man, there were people in there right away. It seems there's a rich history. Are there oral legends and histories about? Well, even to get into that, what really amazes me is not only about the possibilities of the oral history of some place like Stonehenge, but the complete lack of history in the colonial journals. The colonialists kept journals, and you would think that if someone was going to go out and build someplace like America's Stonehenge, you would think they would at least put something in their journal about it. There isn't any. Apparently, it was there when they came. What do you hear about the oral history and what might have gone on there?
Right. On our site, the earliest goes back to when they were writing the history of Salem, and the book came out in 1907, History of Salem by Edgar Gilbert. It was a friend of Robert Frost, as a matter of fact. And however, there is a site down in Connecticut. It's in Groton, Connecticut, just by the name of Gunjiwamp,
Yeah.
And we think, although there's some people disagree, they're talking about that site, but we feel it because there's another site next door, North Stonington, and that's just an amazing site, very close by. So there's been argument which site they were talking about, but I still think it might be Gunjiwamp. 1654, so 368 years ago, John Pynchon wrote to Governor Winthrop and asked about these stone ruins. Now, if they were building them, why was he writing and asking about these old stone ruins? Yeah. So that's one of the early references. But on our site, 1907, the History of Salem, I found out from my dad's first cousin, Oz, who was actually very instrumental in a lot of the research on our site, particularly the astronomical alignments. And he just died a couple of years ago at 95 years old. But he ended up, the last time I saw him in 2016, he brought me some books, and he was going to relocate to Long Island from, he lived in Derry, New Hampshire, right down the street. He was going to relocate down there to live with his daughter. They were having some issues, medical issues and stuff. And he said, my grandmother, Annie Gage, lived in Salem, and she used to come to this what we call America Stonehenge in the 1890s. And I didn't know that. I knew my aunt and uncle were here in the 30s, but it goes back another 40 years before that. But as far as Native American, because maybe about, 90% of them in the area were, unfortunately, they died out because of disease, the hepatitis B, maybe smallpox, that kind of thing. So some of the oral tradition may have been lost. We did have, back in the 90s, a woman named Paula Underwood. She lived on the West Coast. She was an IBM consultant. She was the Iroquois. And when she grew up, her father had her repeat back 10,000 years of oral tradition. So she would have the story right. And I guess she had to repeat it, and keep the story factual or whatever. And in the book she wrote called The Walking People, it's a pretty thick book. I forget the year she published it, but she traveled out from California. We had a prayer circle in our theater. She came out a couple of times to see us, and then she passed away. But when she lived on the West Coast, she didn't know anything about the Northeast stone ruins. And so when she became aware of them sometime in 1990, she was pretty surprised because they're in her oral tradition.
Mhm.
But it wasn't built by her people. It was built by some strange people, according to her, the way she remembered it, you know? So her people said these people are strange and build these stone ruins. So there's a little bit of that there. How accurate that is, oral tradition may be, you know, more accurate than we want to give them credit for, perhaps. 2 years ago, we had the Holzer Files TV show come down for 10 days, for 6 days filming, and they brought in Daryl Jameson, and he's part Wampanoag and branch of that. And I think at the branch, I got a chance to talk to him before they filmed him, and I'd met him before, and he was fully dressed up. It was really nice guy. He said his ancestry, by the way, is Orkney Island blood and Native American blood. And his Jameson, he said he might be part of the Sir Henry St. Clair expedition, Sir James Gunn. You know, they were
yes.
Jameson. It's one of those interesting things. But he goes, on my Native American side, we had nothing to do with your site. That's his feeling and probably his oral tradition. However, on the other side of his blood, you know, he says, you know, there may be something to it. So he actually is on that TV show, and if you watch it, you can get a more accurate, you know, I'm trying to remember exactly what he said about it. But we've had a couple other Native Americans that we've had at our site. For the most part, they say that their ancestry weren't involved with it. But today we know there's about 800 different sites. Our site is one site with 106 acres. From Quebec all the way down to it. So finding out there's some stone ruins in Virginia. And as I mentioned, North Stonington, Connecticut, we became aware of that in 2016 in the fall at a meeting. And it has 8,000 stone features, 25 categories of structures. And the gentleman wrote the book in 2016. This book is called Ceremonial Stonework. When you look through the pages, it's amazing. It's the same kind of stonework we have, but it's spread out over 35,000 acres in the town. And it's only a few miles from Gunjiwang. And it has 400 serpentine walls. It has windows like we have. It has structures. It has a monolith. It even has what we call a shark tooth wall. All these little mini monoliths stood up next to each other. We have that at our site. And one of the pictures shows it down there. And I'm like, that's exactly what we have going on at our site too. So a site can be one chamber like in Windham, New Hampshire, or it can be a site like ours, or it can be the Hudson Valley where there's over 500 sites in Dutchess, Westchester, and Putnam County, going a little west towards Bethel, Monticello, New York, and Woodstock. And I've been in that whole area down there. There are about 500 sites, I should say 500 different chambers. And some of them are serpentine walls too. The serpentine wall thing is going to be, I think, very important. We only found the first one in the spring of 2016. Serpentine wall, it looks like a snake. It has a head, a body, and a tail. And my first one was a linear one, about 27 feet long. I'm looking at it. It was on a road to my dad, where my dad used to live. And he had already passed away. I was going down that road. I happened to see it under certain sunlight conditions, I guess. And I get off my ATV. I walked over to about 70 feet, and I said, and it's on a ridge of bedrock, runs along the ridge. And I'm like, this is not a regular wall. This has like a head. It has a tapered body with a flat tail. And I looked at it, photographs of it, looked at it again. I said, I don't have any frame of reference. I don't know of any other serpentine walls or snakes or whatever, but I think I got one here. Over the next couple of weeks, I located what I thought were two more. One of them was another one was linear. Another one I think was kind of an S-shaped one. And I'm like, I think it's got a triangular head, and it had like a boulder tail, about 140 feet long. And Scott Walters and a whole big entourage, including one of the Alan Butler from England and his wife. He's been on History Channel too. They were all taking a tour of our site, and I said, I got to show you this. This is like around May, I think, of 2016. I'm showing them. I want you guys to be my witness, because I think I have serpentine walls, but I don't really know, because I don't know of any other place that has them. By the fall of 2016, I had found a few more. I went to the meeting in Groton, Connecticut. And when I saw the book, and there's 400 of them down there, the linear, rectilinear, S-shaped, and some actually come around and they look like they're biting the tail, which would be cool.
Yeah.
Hey, Dennis.
And they always want to say, no, these are just boundary markers, but they start someplace and they end someplace, and they're not connected. It's just crazy. I don't understand it.
I guess a comment or question I have here would be that, like, if you've never been to the site, and I haven't, but I've seen lots of pictures that Dennis sent me, and what I notice immediately is this is, in terms of like just not even the layout, but the landscape around the site is so different from any of the places that, if you're into any kind of amateur archaeology, you've seen Stonehenge in England, you've seen the Nazca Lines, you've seen Puma Punku, and on all these places that are like really awesome. And it's clear that you're standing there and, hey, here's a stone. But what we have here is a woodland, heavily forested area. And so you stand there and you go, I think there's something here. I can't really tell. And this is already after you guys have spent like 50 years cutting down trees and whatnot. Now, you mentioned opening up the alignments. So yeah. I think I just want to ask a clarifying question on that. So when you came to the site, you were like, hey, this seems like there might be, like it might be worth looking into a line here. And so you would have had to cut down a bunch of trees, do a lot of bushwhacking, basically create almost a road in order to even see what you're looking at, right?
That is correct. It was all forest. And like I say, in 65, they began clearing out. They knew where one of the stones was located, and they thought the center of the site might be the back site, so they opened up the alignment. It was that gentleman that was the gentleman that was a nuclear engineer, and they had to clear out about 800 feet of trees, probably 50 to 100 feet wide, and maybe averaging around 75 feet wide. So it took quite a while to cut the trees out. And then by 67, we got the first photograph that kind of, showed that I think we're on the right track. The sun is setting right over that stone. And after that, they began clearing out all the other avenues, and it took years to cut the trees down. We have done shovel test pit study across the hill. Our archaeologist just retired, who joined us in 1989. She was the president of the New Hampshire Archaeological Society and friends with all the New Hampshire archaeologists, including a state archaeologist who has the same last name as she did. And he got involved with the site too, Dr. Gary Hume. And her name was Pat Hume. She started a STP, or shovel test pit study, across the 110 acres back in 1991. 89 to 91, she worked on what we call the North Stone alignment. She did an excavation. They found a fire pit that dated 1,300 years old next to the stone. It didn't date when the stone was stood, but it showed that the stone was already standing when somebody built the fire and used the stone as a backstop, if you will. That was 89 and 91 on that one dig. Yeah. She had other people helping her. But 92, she decided to start mapping the hill using these 50 centimeter diameter holes, go down to hit bedrock, or what we call pre-occupational level. And they surveyed these points. And what she said was probably the hilltop was 75% bare 4,000 years ago. Now, her husband was a doctor of geology at Tufts University in Boston, or in Somerville, actually, for 30 years. So he was a great aid in helping her with the geology, because she was recording the geology, the stratigraphy and everything, as well as looking for artifacts, basically, archaeological evidence. And so her thought is the hilltop was pretty much bare, with some vegetation 4,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. So they have the dense forest as we have today. That's one of the criticisms too. Well, if you have all that forest, how do you get to see any alignments? You got to go back in time. And today the hill's covered with very, very thin covering of soil. There are still bedrock areas that are exposed. A few of them are what we call sheetbacks, or actually like the bedrock sticks up and the soil just keeps washing off it from erosion. Someday maybe it will be covered over. But in New England, it's about an inch of soil takes about 125 years. Yeah, that's on the average. That's on a level spot. If you have a hill, you have erosion going on too. So the hilltop, has in some areas, a foot or 2 feet of dirt. In other areas, is still bare from whenever, the glacial period, perhaps. And we have an earthquake fault line that goes right through the center of the site. And a lot of the ancient sites, even Machu Picchu, have that. And some of the stone circles in Scotland. There's like 700 ancient megalithic circles, and they're either on or within a mile and a half of a fracture or an earthquake fault line, if you will.
Yeah.
But field got pretty bare back then, you know.
Yeah.
That's what they had over drainage too. They didn't have the soil to absorb water, so they had to build a network of 12 drains. And if you're going to send a crew out looking for slabs of stone to build the roof slabs, wall slabs, sacrificial table, the monoliths, and in the walls, there's a lot of vertical big slabs stood on the end. You might remember a few of those, Jim, you know, in the wall. Slabs stood up. Those are called orthostats, and they can be part of a structure too. If I sent you two out to look for a stone, like maybe 10 feet by 4 feet, you'd walk around in the woods today going, what the heck, we're going to find the bedrock, you know, in a good area where the stone's fractured. We can't see it. There's trees, there's dirt, there's debris and everything. But 4,000 years ago, we're walking around on a fairly bare hill. You could look at these areas. In the last 40 years, we have found 34 slabs of stones of various sizes still in situ. They've been lifted off the bedrock. They've been propped with another piece of stone. In the edge, you can see them where they're actually hammering them. Like it's like making an arrowhead on a multi-ton scale. Flaking. It's called percussion flaking. Like, and Dr. Gary Hume, our state archaeologist at the time, was involved with it. He goes, well, it's unmistakable that they were actually shaping these stones as though it was a 1.5 or a 2-ton arrowhead. It's Stone Age technology to dress or shape these stones, and you don't see modern tool markings on the tape. Or the roof. That's
okay.
So they were quarrying basically on site and then just moving them a little ways and using them.
I have to ask this question because I know we're going to be running out of time here shortly, and I got to get it in before we quit. Bottom line, your best guess: who built America's Stonehenge, and how did they move those stones back then?
That's the $1 million question. I will say Dr. David Stewart Smith, who passed away just as we were in 2016. He was with us for almost 40 years. He had a couple of doctorates, and he was really a lithic specialist. He worked with Dr. Gary. He says, I think we got a lithic culture across the Northeast of stone builders that is unrecognized, in some cases dismissed by the mainstream academic community. And these are ancient stone builders, you know. But who the actual people were, we don't know at this time. There's theories that they came from Europe, from the Mediterranean. But Native Americans were here 13,000 years. In Keene, New Hampshire, they have a site now 13,000 years old. I didn't realize, you know, that the conditions would, you know, so people could live here at that point, you know. In northern New Hampshire, about 12,000, the Jefferson site up in beyond Mount Washington. And I so people are around here for thousands of years. And how much did they do with our site? I say perhaps the Native Americans did 100% of it, but there's still some things, nagging questions about inscriptions. The V-hut looks like wedge tombs of Ireland, the size, the shape, the orientation. The east-west timber looks like the galley graves I've seen in France or up in Ireland or in Holland. They call them the giants, but same orientation, the same kind of dimensions. The architecture looks similar. I'm not an architect, but they look so similar in style. And there's other features like that, not only at our site, some of the other 800 sites I mentioned across the Northeast. By the way, the Serpentine Walls, we're finding them in Weed, California by Mount Shasta. They're in Colorado. Alabama, a gentleman's been working on them, Dr. Holstein, since 1970s, and he calls them Rattlesnake Walls. He's at Jackson State University. He knows about us now. We know about him, and he wants us to come down and see his Rattlesnake Walls. And he has cairns and standing stones in Alabama too. So it may not just be a Northeast thing. So your question's well taken. I just honestly, I don't know who built the site. You know, I don't believe the Paddy family or any colonial people built this or these other sites that we've been talking about this evening.
You know, there's a new discovery that's just been announced in Alabama. There's a huge thing going on now. Within the last 12, 15 years, people have recognized down here in the Southeast, I'm in South Carolina, about cave art down here. There's a new cave in Alabama with cave art. Nobody knew that there were cave artists in the Southeast. They knew that, you know, pictographs and that kind of thing, but deep in some of these limestone caves, finding evidence of art that reminds you of Western Europe. It's just amazing. I think we're discovering an awful lot about American history that we just don't know anything about.
Absolutely. It's like
there's a ton of evidence that that is just kind of iceberging right now, where we can only see a small, tiny tip of this evidence. But It seems like there was global communication and probably trade from North America to Europe and Asia, probably 8,000 years ago.
And
I'm not going to be at all surprised to find that that was the truth. And it's just amazing. It's an exciting time if we can just, keep our minds open. That's all. That's all.
Exactly.
I know we're just about out of time, but boy, Dennis, Ken, it's been great. I'm on a kind of an 8 o'clock curfew tonight, so I've got to leave you, but really, really appreciate talking to you. And Dennis, someday I'm going to get up there again. I'm going to find a way to do it.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Dennis. And thanks again, viewers, for tuning in. And I'm gonna put the information below, how to get to Dennis's website and all that stuff, and maybe a map or something too, if you want to go visit him in real life. I highly recommend it. It's
me too.
A fabulous site. And in terms of for many of our viewers, it's going to be one of the closest sites that you get a chance to see, because it's world class along the lines of stuff that you might have to fly to Peru or wherever else. And this is really fascinating stuff. And here it is, right in on our own backyard. So yeah, thanks, Dennis. And we'll talk to everyone again on the next episode.
Real good. Thank you. Bye now.
Please visit our sponsor, neandertees.com, fashion for the discriminating Neanderthal.